Hello, one and all. It's me, Shingema. I'm glad to be back here to be talking with you. And I just noticed as I'm recording this video that the top shelf on the top shelf, really on my book shelf here, is looking a little bit wonky. And the reason for that is I didn't actually notice that before. Is because I pulled down all the books that usually populate that's my African literature row, as it were. At least some of them, the ones that are not at work. So yeah, all this. You might have spotted some of your favorites on there already, Matigari. Uh, Homegoing, a recent classic, The League. uh, Indeed. Because I wanted to have them in hand so that I can reference them as we talk about today. And if if the video title and this little bit intro doesn't point you in that direction, we're talking about African literature today, particularly situating contemporary African literature within the larger history, as it were, of African literature and the politics surrounding it. So yeah, we'll be talking about that. It's again one of my favorite things to do, which is why I've spent quite a bit trying to get a lot of these here. It's not as big as I would want it to be, but we're gonna keep baking till we get cake. But without further ado, let me share my PowerPoint screen here. So what is our topic today? Our topic today, I've here called it From Tsuro Nagudo to the Leak and Back. Uh, so Tsuro Nagudo, for those in the know, literally translates to the rabbit or the hare and the baboon, which in Zimbabwean, particularly Shona folk culture. I'm sure in other parts of Africa as well, particularly among that larger Bantu community. I just don't have it on good authority that the same characters show up, right? But in any case, that's the classic pairing of a Tom and Jerry, if you will, to situate it within a larger context. But Tsuro being the more conniving, it's the Brer Rabbit. It's the same Brer Rabbit that you find in mythology, even in the African diaspora, right? Then Baboon being a little more slower, but he's older, he's slower, he's maybe a little portrayed as being a little dim-witted, but he's also very much the moral, uh, sort of the moral figure or the moral foil to Tsuro's conniving, right? Indeed. So I just wanted to use that. Then the leak, of course, uh, as I told you, as I showed earlier, is my book that just came out. It's a little bit of a shameless plug, but also it works well because it came out this year. It's as recent a book of African or African themed history as I could find. So, I just wanted to create that timeline, as it were. So yeah, that's what that's about. I'll put the link to that in the description box as well if anybody's interested in this, among the other things that I'll put in there. All right, cool. So so let's talk about African literature, as a whole, and take it from the beginning, right? This is what we'll be talking about today. We'll be talking about the global socio-literary this idea that the global socio-literary culture has traditionally pigeonholed African literature as either non-existent or a novelty premised on the enduring paradigm of African deficit. Right. I'll unpack that. Storytelling is an enduring bedrock of African communities. That may not need as much unpacking, but I'll be re-emphasizing that as well as we proceed. And African literature provides a space for the preservation of African tradition while also providing a nuanced representation of the continent and its stories in the global space, right? Not just in the pigeonholed, this is African stuff. So we'll talk more about that as I go. Indeed. So this is sort of my abstract for what I'll be talking about today. And hopefully I'm not here too long today. So this is important here. And I put this, if you watch my other video on Afrocentricity or African-centered idea, this shows up again. The idea here is I want to present you with these quotes from three people who've really shaped contemporary global dynamics, people who have shaped academia as we know it, politics as we know it, particularly in the Western world, which in many ways the Western world, because of its hegemonic role in our communities by way of imperialism, right? Is not that influence or that way of being is not just limited to the Western world, right? You see it in the world operates in a Western centric method. You know what I mean? And we can unpack that some other time. So I've got these three quotes here um, from three prominent thinkers, right? The first one here that I've listed is uh, from a gentleman named Trevor Hugh Roper. Trevor Hugh Roper is a professor regis of history, not African history though, but history in general from Oxford University. And he stated that perhaps in the future there will be some African history to teach, but at present there is none. There is only the history of Europeans in Africa. Hugh Trevor Roper, very dismissive, right? This has been dissected and debated. He said this in the 1960s, right? So I mean, he was wrong because there is a lot of African literature and the works of the likes of all the contemporary African historians, but even his own countryman, Basil Davidson, has has wrote robustly about African history in ways that would have put that claim to say. But I'm saying that's somebody who's like he's this position at Oxford, right? Professor Regis. That means that he is at the time in the 1960s, and bear in mind that's in the lifetime of many folks who are around today. In fact, the two American presidential candidates were both of age when these comments were made. If my well, at the very least, they were here and conscious. In any case, so that's been debated. But the important thing here is looking at Trevor Roper's profile. You will see that he's a man who wields a lot of influence in understanding these dynamics. So that's important. Going back further, we look at Hegel, the philosopher Hegel, who says, "For Africa is no historical part of the world. It has no movement or development to exhibit." Right now, Hegel is important, one of the most important philosophers who really shaped academia. In fact, his work on art appreciation and art history leads him to define what beauty actually is, right? His theory on beauty is one that defines what beauty is, right? So if somebody who says this, right, who defines beauty for the academy feels this way about Africa, how do you think he views any artworks coming out of Africa, right? In any case. Then we go further here to Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of these United States, who once said, talking about Black people, right? Comparing them by their faculties of memory, reason, and imagination, it appears to me that in memory they are equal to the whites, and in reason much inferior, and that in imagination they are dull, tasteless, and anomalous. Somebody who shapes the conscience of the world and our understanding of it feels this way about Black people, right? That in imagination, they're dull, tasteless, and anomalous. And why am I starting with this? I'm starting with this because this shows us the ways in which the powers that be in academia, in philosophy, in politics have shaped us to understand the artistic creations or the literary contributions of Africans. So, indeed. So this study, the work that I'm doing here, aligns with the paradigm of literary Pan-Africanism, which is designed, and I quote here from Cyril McDougall, scholar Cyril McDougall, the proper explanation of content, form, and function of African literary creations to ensure that these works are placed in their proper historical context and evaluated based on their practical relevance and problem-solving capacity. That's Dr. Cyril McDougall from his book Africana Research Methods. So I'm reading Cyril McDougall to juxtapose to these quotes here because it tells us that there is something that was being misconstrued. How is it possible that the people who've defined the academy for the world feel this way about Africans and, as an extension, African writing? and Cyril McDougall is advocating for the remedying of that. So before we discuss specific texts, authors, and their significance in the context of this conversation, it is important that we recognize the inherent political nature of the printed word in general and of African literature in particular. Right. In his canonical text, Imagined Communities, the scholar Benedict Anderson cites the rise of print capitalism as the catalyst for modern nationalism, arguing that having a plethora of localized languages in print fostered a sense of belonging among those that each language spoke to, as well as giving languages and their speakers an impression of antiquity, a critical element in both imperial and anti-colonial nationalisms. So, why does this matter? When you look at the quotes that are still on your screen right now, right? The big thing is to say, in many ways, the righteous indignation from which they speak is rooted in a long literary tradition that in many parts of Africa was not present, you know. So for Africa, as with other colonized peoples, the printed word itself was resistance. It is what we use to push back against these notions. The absence of a strong literary tradition within many pre-colonial communities, particularly in Southern Africa, was often and continues to be cited as proof of African inferiority by the colonialists, right? Thus, the very notion of Africans writing in both their native and colonial languages was more than just artistry. It was innately subversive. What do we mean by innately subversive, right? So when Jefferson says in imagination they are dull, tasteless, and anomalous, the publication of these works was in direct confrontation to that, right? When folks started to write about the history of Africa and putting it out there, it was in direct confrontation with what Hugh Trevor Roper had written, right? When folks are writing these amazing stories, right? It's hard to deny that there is a development to exhibit within these spaces, right? So it was inherently political in those spaces. Ali Mazrui, the author Ali Mazrui, makes this case when he writes, and I quote, if the general absence of the written word was a part of Africa's sense of humiliation during the colonial period, the outburst of written creativity among Africans since those early days became part of Africa's vindication of itself. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, famed Kenyan writer who we'll also be talking about today, reiterates his sentiments when he says that Berlin of 1884, the Scramble for Africa, which I've made a video on, you can also watch that, was effected through the sword and the bullet. But the night of the sword and the bullet was followed by the morning of the chalk and the blockboard. The physical violence of the battlefield was followed by the physical violence of the psychological violence of the classroom. Sorry. But when the former was visibly brutal, the latter was visibly gentle. The bullet was the means of physical subjugation. Language was the means of spiritual subjugation. This is from the book Decolonizing the Mind by Ngugi. Indeed, it was this recognition that provided the backbone for cultural Pan-Africanism and Renaissance articulated by the founders of Negritude, Ngugi, and others, right? So what am I saying? The big thing that I'm emphasizing here is the fact that the absence of a robust writing traditions, particularly in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, was used to justify the inferiority of people of African descent. Used as an, and once you can justify that, you can justify enslaving these folks. You can justify colonizing these folks in the brutal way that it happened, right? Indeed. So writing thus becomes inherently resistance. But let's quickly evaluate this claim that there was no, literary traditions in Africa prior to the encounter or prior to the era of Western exploration. Oh yeah, these are the two quotes that I referenced just now. So take a moment to read them as well. I didn't know I had them on the next slide here. All right, and we write. Now, the very idea that there was no literary traditions in Africa prior to to the era of European exploration prior to the 15th century, for example, is also nonsense, right? Though I will come back and give it due credence, or give it its rightful place, because it's nonsense as an actual fact, but it's rooted in something, right? It's not entirely baseless. So here we see, um, I decided to find different instances of a developing literary culture going back. So here, to your left, you will see rock paintings found in Domboshawa, that's in Zimbabwe. Dombo shower means like light stone, gray stone, or something. It anyway. Coincidentally, the area where this is found, or near to where this is now, is called Greystone Park. So I wonder if there's any connection. I mean, I'm sure it's rooted in the same thing. But Dombo shower, right? I used to live pretty close to this place, so sometimes we would go over to see this. But these are tens of thousands of years old, right? So again, prehistorical, really, that some of the people who lived in that area used to paint caves and stone walls with these things to communicate different rituals, give directions, and so forth, tell their stories that way. So now, of course, this is even pre-hieroglyphics, but even the hieroglyphics themselves in Egypt, those are African writing systems, right? Indeed, and we have to give them that place. So that's what this is. Crossing right. Oh, let's go bottom left. You'll see they're continuing in, since we're talking about hieroglyphics, in the Common Era, right? BC. A new literary tradition, particularly with Greek occupation of the Mediterranean, a new writing system developed, which blended some elements of the old school Egyptian writing systems, hieroglyphics and whatnot, with elements of Greek to create the written language we call Coptic. For if it's synonymous with the Coptic Church. So this book here is actually, I don't know if it's the actual Bible, but it's a Coptic religious book, right? Indeed. So that's something else cool that we can look at. This came out in the beginning in the first century AD or CE, and would and lasted into the fourth or fifth century. So again, we've spoken about Egypt. We can see that there's this literary tradition, and again, the Coptics even have impact as far down as Nubia. So you also see similar writings there at the time. Uh, to the right, with the gentleman reading reading the open book here, that is the oldest, most complete Bible ever found, known to man. It was found in the, in one of the. It was rediscovered in the 1980s in a monastery in Ethiopia. Right? It's written in Ge'ez. Somebody who knows better how to pronounce that, let me know. But it's GE''EZ, evolved from Aramaic, right? Goes way back. But in any case, there's this, which gives rise. In fact, when you talk about religion, there's a funny anecdote, or funny in retrospect, where the Portuguese in the 16th century have circled the continent and ended up in Ethiopia, and we're trying to convert the Ethiopians, only to find out that the Ethiopians have been Christian much longer than than just about anybody, right? They have, the oldest, most complete Bible written in the 5th century AD was discovered over there. So that's another thing. Keeping in Ethiopia for a while, let's talk about this book that's in the center here, known as the Kebra Negast. The Kebra Negast, which translates to the glory of the kings. This text contains an account of how the Queen of Sheba, or Queen Makeda of Ethiopia, met King Solomon, biblical King Solomon, and about how the Ark of the Covenant came to Ethiopia with their son Menelik the First. It also discusses the conversion of Ethiopians from the worship of the sun, moon, and stars to that of the Lord God of Israel. So uh, the idea of this situates the idea of Ethiopians and having that connection with the Holy Land, right? I often hear about, yeah, Ethiopian Jews, or the robust Ethiopian Orthodox Christian Church. Indeed. So that's that book comes out in the, supposedly in the 11th century or so. Um, No, probably earlier. It just rose to prominence at the time with the Solomonic dynasties coming to the fore. But all this to say, Ethiopia, we see there's a robust literary tradition as well. And here's in the bottom right, there's this article that came out from Boston University. Again, it's not a peer-reviewed article, nothing. It was just a spotlight about how this anthropologist Falun Gong had discovered this language called Ajami, which is a modified Arabic script in a box of his late father's old papers. Right? It's Senegalese. Um, and the idea of, especially under French colonialism, that the fact that these folks did not have a script prior to the French coming, was another thing that was used to justify their inferiority. But of course, we know that the Muslims had been there for centuries, and actually a lot of the people in Senegal are Muslim to this day. That some of the laymen, or some of the even people in the rural areas, had adopted elements of Arabic as the official language, and then in this case it's been modified, um, you know, into this language called Ajami. So I enjoyed that article, though I did feel like Boston University was doing a little editorializing, as it were, because it seemed like a lot of people already knew this existed. It didn't it the idea of them discovering it when a whole community of people, including traders and vendors, have been using it for centuries now, it just sounded a little off. But similar to Ajami, that's in West Africa. In East Africa, you had Swahili, which had also the earliest published works thereof go back to the early 1700s, right? Uh, this is before that era is fully set up. Those works are written in Swahili, in the Swahili language, but in Arabic script. So there has been this long literary tradition. However, even as we say all that, so we see it in the on the coast, right? The Swahili, we see it in Ethiopia, we see it in Egypt. All this, we see it even in some form in Senegal with this. But so there was a literary presence in Africa already. However, to oversell it, right, would also be to romanticize, romanticize this dynamics. In many parts of the continent, oral tradition reigned supreme, right? So there's a few spots like this where there was literacy in apparently pre-literate Africa. However, yeah, for the vast majority of the continent, oral tradition reigns supreme. That's why we have sarungano in in Shona culture. That's why we have griots in West Africa, right? So there is not a robust written records, of what probably amounts to billions, or more than a billion people today, right? Despite the presence of these spots in which the history was being written. So it is that logic that is then implemented to say, look, these people don't even write. How can we even qualify them as equals, right? And that adds to the humiliation, as Ali Mazrui described it in that quote I read earlier. All right. So in many parts, in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, in the Congo, and so forth, there really is no evidence of a robust written tradition, right? It was communities that were satisfied with oral tradition as a modus vivendi, as it were, right? However, once colonial slavery and colonialism came into play, and people started to get conscious of the fact that this not only left the communities susceptible to erasure, right, both physical and spiritual. It was also being used to demean and denigrate them, right? Folks got to writing right away, right? So let's talk a little bit about that. Right at the moment of the encounter, right? And the moment that the African folks could write, folks got to writing. We know famously here the first book, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, who was enslaved. This book came out in 1789, right? He was an Igbo man who was enslaved and lived in Britain for a while and became a large abolitionist, right? So you have stories like that. You have Africanus Horton, pictured here, whose name is James, I believe, James Horton, and he insisted on including the name Africanus. He was from Sierra Leone, you know. So when he graduated, I think he graduated from Edinburgh University in Scotland. One of the first Africans or people of African descent to graduate from there. But he's put out this book here titled "The Dawn of Nationalism in Modern Africa." This came out in 1867, a little bit, a couple of decades after Olaudah's work. But he's another guy who was also writing from, for the redemption of Africa, as it were, albeit from the New World, right? Or not the New World, from the West. He's in the UK. He's doing these things. Other books that fall into that category as well are books like the writings of Edward Blyden, and several other Africans were writing these works, right? And of course, if we talk about the diaspora as a whole, there's a robust literary tradition within Black America as well in the Caribbean. So indeed, so there's a lot of this happening. The first book, right? So when do we start? But these books, because of they're more academic or autobiographical, they don't really represent that boom in literary culture. By that, we're talking more about fiction, novels, and these things, right? But while a cursory search will often refer to Chinua Achebe's classic, Things Fall Apart. Do I have a copy of that one? Things Fall Apart, as the seminal novel published in a colonial language, right? Because at this point, some Africans have also started to write some novels, but they're writing them in their native languages, right? This is often regarded to, it came out in 1958. Think about how recent that is often regarded as a seminal novel published in a colonial language. This particular history actually dates back to the turn of the century. This is popular, yes, it's one of the most popular books in the world, but it's actually not the first one, right? Published in the colonies in a colonial language. In 1911, Joseph Ephraim Casely Hayford, also known as Accra Ageman of the Gold Coast, which is now Ghana, published what is probably the first African novel written in English. Ethiopia Unbound, you can see it here. Studies in race emancipation. Right. So although this work moves between fiction and political advocacy, its publication and positive reviews in the Western press mark a watershed moment in African literature. So 1911, the first novel, right, published in a colonial language, whether French or English or Portuguese or German, is published Ethiopia Unbound by Joseph Ephraim Casely Hayford of Gold Coast, which is now Ghana. At that point, a tradition had started. 1911 is that seminal moment. So at this point, I defer real quick to one of the most prolific writers ever out of Zimbabwe, Dambudzo Marechera, who born in 1952, died in 1987, a month after I was born. He gave this interview in 1986, and I will put the link to that part of to a SoundCloud link of that interview, at least the part that he talks about this, in which he described in detail how at the time, he's talking in 86, of course, that there were two main traditions in African writing that existed. There were the traditionalists, and the traditionalists almost wished for a return to pre-colonial ideals, right? That's putting it simply, negotiating the era of being colonized, very even socialist, but not socialist in the Cold War left-leaning socialist that we understand it to be, but almost that pre-colonial era of Afro-socialism, right? Almost a wistful um, reminiscing of those good old days, as it were. And among those writers, these are some of the books. In and when Dambudzo Marechera is describing it, he calls it. He cites Chinua Achebe and Ngugi in particular, but I've added a couple of texts here too that I think speak to the same. The first one here in this series is actually Moody by Saul Plaatje, who's the first Secretary General of the African National Congress, right? Who was a renowned Botswana man of words, is Botswana, whose book Moody, published in 1930, by the way, was the first English novel written by a Black South African. Despite being in English, Moody has been described as essentially a Setswana novel written in English due to its Afrocentric linguistic expression and bold nationalistic assertions. In Moody, as in his other writings, Saul Plaatje was a forerunner of the notion through which African authors recreate their pre-colonial history as a basis for nationalism and the imagining of a post-colonial nation. Indeed, even the iconic Chinua Achebe recognizes this when he comments, long before Ngugi said, "I want to write about the past as a way of writing about the present." Plaatje was already doing exactly that. End quote. I actually didn't notice this when I put this slide together, that this quote is from this guy talking about this guy to praise this guy. Now, right. So this was published in 1930. Chinua Achebe, the book that's again the Things Fall Apart book. I showed a different edition when I lifted it, which is largely regarded as you ask many people, they might say it's the first of, but we've already proven that there were a few that existed before then, going back to 1911 or 1930, if you're talking about Moody. But this was published in 1958. It's widely regarded as one of the best books ever written. I see it on lists of top 100 or top 200 books. Chinua Achebe himself is a legend. Died a few years, I mean, maybe a decade ago now. Yeah, just incredible book. Indeed. Another book that I'm surprised I didn't end up including on this PowerPoint, I should have, is God's Bits of Wood by Ousmane Sembene of Senegal, who's now is widely renowned as a filmmaker more than a novelist, but that novel is fantastic. And I think there's a little bit of anti-francophone or pro-anglophone bias, because I can't imagine I'd never heard of that book until now. I just read it this past year, published in 1960. Incredible work, and dare I say, in a vacuum, I might even give it an edge over Things Fall Apart. It is that good. It's a brilliant book. It's in front. A Grain of Wheat comes out later here in 1967. It's not Ngugi's first book, but he writes a bunch of them. On Trial for My Country comes out in 1966 over here. This is by Zimbabwean author Stanley Samkange. So these are those stories. You can even tell by a lot of the graphics that there's an element of traditional pre-colonial over here on Trial. That's a picture of King Lobengula, who was the last king, who was the Bulawayo king, sort of the sovereign in that Zimbabwean space for the most part that the colonizers came across. So the On Trial for My Country, juxtaposes Cecil John Rhodes over here being tried by his ancestors, and Lobengula being tried by his. So these are some of the traditionalist books, tradition. By now, you can tell. So beginning in 1930, but really picking up after the Second World War in the 50s going forward, we see a boom in African literature written in the colonial languages, and of course in the African languages as well. I'll be remiss if I didn't talk about things like Umvukela Akwamandebele, written in 1956 by Reverend uh, Ndabaningi Sitole. Sokore Sinamsoro, the poem written by the epic poem written by Herbert Chitepo. You can tell that my Zimbabwean bias is showing because those are the examples that come in. So that is the first wave of African literature, right? That comes through at in that post World War One, definitely post World War II era, and sort of accompanied the anti-colonial fight. The next group that Marechera spoke about is a group we can call the modernists, of which he posits himself as being part of. Now, remember, he's writing this in the 80s, right? He's writing this in the 80s. And there is a bit of a rivalry in his tone between the modernists and the traditionalists. In his tone, when I say he describes that he's experienced some level of hostilities, because the traditionalists, but this is typical generational stuff. The traditionalists feel that, okay, let's describe what the modernists are in this space, right? That they are more worldly, right? They're not necessarily rooted in a pre-colonial reality or a desire to return to that. They've realized that colonialism happened or is happening in some of these places. It's not even over when these works come out. For example, this next book, In the Fog of Seasons End, comes out in 1972, South Africa. That's at least 20 years before the end of apartheid, right? But they're now dealing with contemporary problems. They're now starting to situate their existence as part of a larger globe. They are very much urbanized. They're talking about the urban experience, that negotiation, right? These are the modernists. That's why you get the likes of, like you said, the House of Hunger, whose opening line, "I got my things and left," is one of the most phenomenal opening lines of all time. In the Fog of Seasons, and I've spoken about, I really enjoy that. Uh, Nervous Conditions over here actually makes a reference to The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. That's where the term nervous conditions is drawn from. It's published in 1987. By the way, the first ever novel published by a Black Zimbabwean woman in English, 1987. That's the year I was born. So how recent is that? Right? And of course, Yvonne Vera comes out with the Stone Virgins in the 1990s. In many ways, another woman out of Zimbabwe, so sort of following in the footsteps that were initially charted by Tsitsi Dangarembga in Nervous Conditions. But when you read Nervous Conditions, they're talking about there's still that traditionalism in there, but the story rests upon an uncle, a mission-educated uncle who's spent some time in the UK, whose wife also has at the very least has a bachelor's degree. I don't know if it was a master's, but anyway, the wife is also very educated, but she still plays subservient because so there's that debate about gender roles and so forth. So there's these conversations happening. So what is it that Dambuzo Marechera had a gripe with? Well, you listen again. I'll include the link here. It's just an 8-minute audio. I'll put that in the comments. In the description box. But it's saying the old heads, right? The traditionalists view us as being more individualistic, not necessarily committed to righting the wrongs of yesteryear, writing here with an R, as much as they are. And we are here, in this argument that we are fighting a different kind of struggle, right? For now that this has played out the way it is and there's no going back, we're now fighting to assert our space within the global world in its modern contemporary dynamic. So that's the second group. So those are the two groups he spoke about, but then he passed on the following year. And I hereby argue, this is my own contribution to this conversation, that in the past 30 years or so, since we lost Marechera, a third group or a third tradition of writers can be added here, because also it's important to know that works that are coming out today could still be part of the modernist or the traditionalist era, depending on how people's writing styles. Of course, they have seen their the traditionalists in particular have seen their heyday, but you still see that. The third group that I'm talking about, that the generation to which we belong, or at least I belong, is what we might call the Afropolitan writers. The Afropolitan writers, right? And let's define Afropolitanism real quick. And I've put up a couple quotes here, if you humor me. This one is one that I can't remember where I found this, but it captures the essence. Afropolitanism is a conceptual space in which African heritage realities are both interrogated and understood with the tools and nuances of modern day globalization. Right. Here's another definition from a lady named Sarah Balakrishnan. She actually runs a website dedicated to Afropolitan phenomena. And when I'm done with this, I'll give some examples so you see what I'm talking about. Afropolitanism refers to a way of being African in the world, of being African, African, and cosmopolitan, and observing African cultures themselves as hybridities formed from many different influences and roots. Right. So what are we saying? What is it that we are actually saying here? Well, the Afropolitan word says this. Traditionally, back in the past, Africa was just this inferior place with which we either don't engage, erasure, or we exoticize, right? Oh, it's the cannibal pygmies of the jungle and all these things. And that sounds very antiquated, but even in very recent histories, right? When you look at the ways in which when you read books like The Heart of Darkness, or when you watch movies like The Gods Must Be Crazy, you may find those hilarious, and a lot of us do as well. But there is a primitiveness to, or a savagery to the ways in which we want to understand Africa. Even when we look at it at its best, African music back in the day, we're still looking at it as, oh my God, they do this, thing with a bongo drum, and it's almost celebrated as a novelty, right? Now, oh, by the way, if I'm sweating like a pig, it's just really hot. It's not because you know, it ain't because I've put on too much Vaseline on my face or not. So what am I to so there's been a shift away from that, particularly in the 21st century, which is why you can we'll get back to the literature real quick, but which is why when you watch movies like Black Panther, right? And you're looking at the representation, think about how that departs from ways that Africans have been depicted in movies in the past and out of Africa in The Ghost and the Darkness, even in recently as The Last King of Scotland, whatever. We can talk about this all day. But here to center this story as having African heroes and African sophistication and nuances where sadness and happiness and not just some barbaric, you know, I'll include, so many things I have to include. I'll include a short article, satire piece by Binyavanga Wainaina, may he rest in peace, called How to Write About Africa. Some of you guys will be familiar with it, in which he talks about these tropes to look for, but these are changing. So you see that. Or when you have someone like Trevor Noah hosting The Daily Show, who is there, and him being African is not an entire shtick where it's kind of like he's, hamming it up like Kamala from the WWE back in the day. Or he's also not being totally dismissive of his being African. That's very much a part of his. Think about music with people like Burna Boy, or the way Afro beats is infiltrating this place now. It's no longer just either erased or ideas are stolen or exotified in ways that they don't belong with the rest of music. Now it's really African music or Afro beats and its infusions is now global pop music, right? Again, Trevor Noah being on that show I spoke about, when you have people like Giannis, who's Nigerian, but is Greek and is now American and is one of the best basketball players in the world, right? And not, no parts of that identity are being torn away. So this is what that is. So when you look at these books here, Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, famous for her Danger of a Single Story video. We Need New Names, award-winning, book here, finalist for the Man Booker Prize by No Violet Bulawayo, Zimbabwean writer, who the book is actually in two parts, them growing up in Bulawayo in Zimbabwe, then moving to Michigan, Detroit, Michigan, like Michigan, Kalamazoo. Trevor Noah again. This is a autobiography, but it still tells a story, right? And how he navigates those worlds. Homegoing actually does something interesting because it doesn't tell a contemporary story at all. Well, it tells a story going back into being enslaved, right, from Ghana with the Fante and Asante communities encountering the British for the first time. But it lives in both worlds, right? It takes us through, right, how the generations survived during the or navigate slavery while the other people who were left behind are also navigating it all the way to the modern era. Brilliantly done. Then of course the leak. I was telling you about that. I'm not shaming my game, but the leak is my latest book. Again, very short, 100 pages or so, big print. But it tells the story. Again, there's that negotiation of a guy who's struggling, the titular character who is struggling in Zimbabwe and is visited by his cousin who now lives in the US with an opportunity to move to the US. So yeah, this Afropolitan tradition runs deep. I could go even further. Let me see. Do I have other books that are within that tradition? We can look at y'all might know this one. This is Tommy Adeyemi's New York bestseller, actually, Children of Blood and Bone, sort of dabbling into that Afrofuturist tradition again, which is not counter to being Afropolitan. It could be both, right? Afropolitan and Afrofuturist, they're not measured on the same scale, as it were. So you have books like that. You have what other stuff do I have here that's within this space? Uh, I'll show at least one more here. But yeah, um, we've not. No, that's not it. Anyway, Uh, oh yeah, so long. Do I have so long a letter somewhere here? But anyway, right. So you have books like So Long a Letter and Love Noir. That's actually what I was looking for. I can't seem to find it amidst the mess I've made here. But in any case, oh yeah, there it is. It's right here. Love Noir, right? Which navigates France, West Africa. I think it's Mali, and oh no, it's Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, and the US. Yeah. So again, we're very exciting times being in this moment in African history, and just being able to ride within that tradition. Um. Okay. So often neglected in this conversation is art for children, right? But I've been so glad to find so many people who are now writing for kids. Even I've even been commissioned to write a couple things, which I believe one of these, yeah, the one at the bottom here, coming out in July 2024, is mine, working with a group called Sunrise. But again, I want to turn this into a promo. We'll talk more about that when the time comes. But I'm just saying Sunrise is doing some amazing work. But here are the books as well. Shout out to Ndawana and friends who've been putting out a lot of the stuff that I know is Zimbabwean, of course, because my African friends who've been looking for these things in the US are people who are trying to uh, make sure their kids relate with their Zimbabwean tradition in particular. So yeah, and that one and Friends is a great one. The Adventures of Lula and Buso, fantastic work. Eco Girl by Ken Wilson Mask, right? So I'm so glad to see that this is also happening. That as we continue to write these bigger painful and diverse and fun stories for the literati, that we're also not forgetting the kids. So it's beautiful to see these works here. If anybody's interested in learning more about children's literature, coming out of Africa, let me know, and we'll be sure to break that down as well. And there's a tweet that came out a few years ago, 2018 now, that I'd like to reference. Shout out to Rabbi Daniel Rutenberg, who says, "We need diverse representation, not only so every kid can see themselves as the hero of the story, but so that every kid can understand that other kinds of kids are also the heroes of their story." This is the point right here. We talk about this all the time when we talk about representation, because a lot of times we assume that representation means that in a world dominated by Western literature or Western heroes, right, or Western protagonists, it helps the black and the brown kids or the African and these other kids to see black heroes as well, or black and brown heroes as well, African heroes as well, which it does. It absolutely does. However, equally as importantly, is other people seeing the same way that I deify whether it's James Bond, who's a fictional character, right? Or Harry Potter, another fictional character, but even knowing so much about real life, sort of this Abraham Lincolns and historical figures, due to the ways in which their stories have been told time and again. It I have no, and I can even say go to something like Rocky or whoever or Rudy from the movie Rudy, right? These are also such easy heroes for us. And I know I just mentioned a bunch of guys there, but the same can be said for The Devil Wears Prada as a protagonist, right? Hermione from the Harry Potter series. Uh uh um Scout and those guys from To Kill a Mockingbird, right? So easily relate. What's the point I'm making here? It's not only important that, that means I come into the spaces with some reverence for the people and their ways of their people. Now, what is it going to take for European and kids in the West to be huge fans of African heroes and stories, right? In the same way that I just described it being conversely true, right? And what does that mean for how you appreciate a people, right? When T'Challa, speaking about the movies, is one of your favorite superheroes. That changes everything. That starts to change things. No, it doesn't change everything, but it starts to change things. So again, we build a mutual appreciation of each other and our ways and the ways in which we tell stories and how we depict each other that way, right? Representation is not only that I feel represented and that makes me feel good, but I also need you to see me being represented in the way that I've seen you being represented, if that makes sense. All right, and we're coming to an end here. So real quick, and I'm putting on my business hat here. And, the SWOT analysis, I always find it very accessible. So I do want to just talk about the SWOT analysis, do a quick SWOT analysis here. So what are the strengths as we move towards the proliferation of African literature, right? The first strength, okay, right now I just boiled down the strength to one thing. A lot of the other strength dovetail with the opportunities. I do want to speak on that. Good and many stories, right? There's a lot of African stories. In fact, the fact that major, whether it's Hollywood, whether it's the traditional big companies, or traditionally just how we've been able to get the work out there, have not really focused on these for the same reasons of marginalization that we saw with Jefferson and them earlier. It means that in an era in which movies are dominated by remakes, if not straight up remakes, it's ideas that we've seen before. And I keep talking about movies, but books are the same, right? The tropes, how many times are you going to read a book about this love triangle with these kids, the teenagers who have been stuck in an unpleasant, if I that description alone works for like half a dozen books I can think of from just the 2010s, I'm saying, different series. So there's so many stories out there that are good, but have never been explored before, right? So that means a lot of the stuff is going to be fresh new when we start, so that's a strength right there. If you're going to start writing these stories have not been heard before, not to a wider audience. So that's exciting. What is the weakness? I also just have one weakness because the rest of them I listed them as threats. I think even though those stories exist, there's still a persisting marginalization of these stories that are not from, even in an era of Afropolitan. Oh, by the way, Afropolitanism, I forgot to explain, to say that Afropolitanism is a portmanteau of the word African or Afro and cosmopolitan. So it's really talking about Africans existing within this cosmopolitan. But even within that space, you may find that people are still kind of about these other stories, and it's not just African stories, it's also Native American stories and maybe Latin American stories or Asian or Middle Eastern stories, right? In the mainstream, right? So there's still that resistance, which is why, for example, I'd written something a while back when when the new Little Mermaid movie came out featuring the beautiful Miss Bailey, and I celebrated with everybody, but I was also keen to make sure that we understand that this is not the victory in representation we are looking for. Because if you are just telling a European story and putting a black face in it or black faces in it, still a European story in terms of the values, in terms of the storytelling, in terms of these things. When Africa and the African diaspora is chock full of stories that have never been explored, we need to get those out there. We need to be publishing these stories here. We need to have big budget movies that tell these stories here, these stories here, these stories here. Right? So we're still struggling with that, even though progress has been made. So what are the opportunities that exist here? Again, untapped original stories. I just spoke about that, right? That there's all the stories that are still to be told that haven't been told. And in an era where we seem like we're running out of ideas, we can do that. We can do that. There's also an opportunity here towards remedying erasure, that there is no reason why the stories of African children, whether princesses or whatever, are not part of the Disney canon. You know what I'm saying? And I know I'm saying Disney, and that's a different kind of monster. But I'm saying there's no reason for that, right? There is no reason why the only sort of canonical African animated film for a long time in Disney was The Lion King, which doesn't have people in it, right? As compared to everything else that has people in it, right? So we also want to just have those stories out there. Let's tell those stories, right? The stories of Mansa Musa, right? The world's richest man. The stories of Queen Amina, the stories of Queen Jinga, right? And even the stories of the common, just like the folk tales from these places that we can also leverage. Of course, representation and authenticity. Who better to tell our story than us, right? There's also the opportunity in that even though we're not there yet, there's a growing interest in these diverse stories. People are starting to explore. More studios are opening. People will clown things like Tubi, right? It's just on the tip of my tongue here. But that's actually allowing. I don't know if there's been any African stories there, but I'm saying the decentralization of ways in which you can get your work out here uh, allows for the potential to have the stories told, on these platforms in ways that we didn't often have before. Similarly, with that, there's more self-publishing options, right? You can literally now do the work on the back. Back in the day, you would have to wait for a big publisher, right? The Henneman, the Penguins, and if those guys, they're big for a reason, right? And part of that is the gatekeeping that goes with it. um uh you'd be very fortunate to get a break in those spaces. But now you can put your book out on Amazon, market it via social media, right, and so forth, and actually do decently with that, right, and do a decent run with that. Oh, that's sort of absolute self-public publishing, but also just smaller publishers. It's still self-publishing if you put it up yourself. But I'm saying, like, my publishers for the leak, shout out Carnelian Heart Publishing in the UK, right? Zimbabwean immigrants to the UK, women who started this initiative. And now this book, I was on the news in the US talking about this book that's been published by Zimbabwean immigrants to the UK, right? Uh, do we have the budgets of some of these other spaces for promo? Hell no. But I can get the book out there, right? So there's these opportunities as well to publish. You still have to do your due diligence, right, as an author and editor and so forth. But there are all these other things. So that's another opportunity that exists. Also now multimodal reading, right? Because the physics of reading, or say a book gets published over here, maybe because I got the resources here, or even if it gets published in Zimbabwe and we want to get it over here, then you have to ship hundreds of books and so forth, or carry them, or find a way to do that. It's just tough. It's hard to do. But now, due to multimodal reading, right, audiobooks, Kindle, the book itself being enduring, again, audiobooks, people might put up readings of the books to places like YouTube, which are easily accessible. um and things being so there are different ways in which we can read now, which really help. We stand as an opportunity for, you really could, your book could go viral without ever being, without people never getting a hold of the print copy now, which is phenomenal, right? So indeed, these are all opportunities. What are some of the threats though? Ah, for all the multimodal options, reading culture is just on the decline. There's no doubting that. I think between the rise of social media and the internet, I'm not one of these woe is me old boomer cats. It just is what it is, right? People don't read as much as they used to. I was in Zimbabwe. I'm saying that to say, in the US, of course, I've noticed that the libraries here, aren't as central as they once were. They're very good, if not better than they've ever been. They're just, the culture around them, as far as people going, is changing. I was in Zimbabwe last summer, and I passed by the library that I wrote about in my book Pashena. Uh, there's a video of me saying this because I recorded. I was like, wow, I can't believe they shut the library down. And my cousin was recording it from behind the camera, says, no, it's not shut down. It's just that nobody goes there, you know. So that's tough too. Another threat is publishing costs. Yeah, even though self-publishing is available, right? To do a good job, you still have to get it edited. You still have to pay a little bit to get it out there, maybe get a good cover design. It still costs quite a bit. The book that I put out prior to this, Pasena, working with the publisher, smaller if you get the big game publishers, and again, we already spoke about how hard that is, but was a publishing house out of Detroit. I paid $3,000 over like a year to get the book through the process. Then so that's prohibitive for a lot of people, uh so that's a challenge for sure. Even if it was much less, the publishers I worked with for the leak did it for free. I mean, not entirely for free. I didn't have to pay them. They take a part of they get their cut in the profits as they come in. But even that, that's a burden on their end as well. So people, that's another struggle that people, publishing costs are just tough. Finally, distribution, even with all multimodal readings, still places where you still need to get the hard copy of the book, right? Oh, I mean, among the multimodal things, you can, people send books via WhatsApp and things, but there's places with limited internet access who can't easily access these books. You have to send them, and that's a little bit tough. Just distributing, even getting your book noticed enough for somebody to be invested in making sure that it's well distributed. Sometimes I'll hear, like my mom, for example, who I love, she lives in Australia. She was saying, "Yeah, we should have the leak in Australian bookstores. I can tell my friends to just go get it there." I'm like, Mom, you know how expensive that would be on the off chance that one or two people buy a book, so if you're not part of that larger publishing house that can absorb those costs a little bit better. So these are some of the threats, but really, as you can tell, I've leaned in heavily on the opportunities here. Um, yeah, and it's a very exciting time for African literature. I'm hoping to see it continue to grow. So yeah, this was a rather shorter video. I just wanted to talk about African literature, which is one of the loves of my life, and sort of historicize it a little bit and some of the contestations that we are faced with. And I hope you enjoy this one. And make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And all those links I mentioned, I'm going to include in the description box below. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. One.